Hi all. In our last lecture, the Intro to Contractarianism, we discussed two different inroads into Contractarianism, thinking about the Hobbesian state of nature and thinking about the prisoner's dilemma. We talked about the basic principle of Contractarianism, which we can use to determine which rules we should adopt. And we left off with a promissory note that we will fill in rules, see which rules this principle might lead us to adopt, rules that might be action guiding or at least give us some idea of how we might want to form our society. So if not action guiding, then at least policy guiding. So recall from last time that the fundamental principle of contractarianism is this, that any action that is morally right just because they're permitted by the rules that free, equal, and rational people would agree to live by, on the condition that others obey these rules as well. And a corollary of that, a morally wrong action is morally wrong just because they would be forbidden by rules that free, equal, and rational people would agree to live by on the condition that others obey these as well. And also, an action is permitted if it's allowed by the rules that free, equal, and rational people would agree to live by on the condition that others obey these as well. So that's where we left off last time. We're seeing what kind of rules this principle might lead us to adopt. So in today's lecture, I'd like to first introduce John Rawls, who will provide us with another inroad into contractarianism, and we'll show how that new inroad allows us to apply this principle, to get ourselves in the mindset of applying this principle, and we'll see what kind of rules come out of it for policy making and that are potentially action guiding. All right, so that's our plan. Let's jump into it. So John Rawls is the author of A Theory of Justice, among other seminal works in political philosophy. In A Theory of Justice, he developed a new view of justice as fairness, and that's the idea we'll be exploring in this lecture. He's considered by many, probably by most, to be the most important political philosopher of the 20th century, and probably has a claim to one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. So we'll be looking at first his new inroad into thinking about contractarianism. And before we get to his way of presenting this, I want to present an analogy here. So imagine you're playing a poker game with a friend, and in this game, the cards are dealt. You've been playing for a while, and after a while, you deal out a hand, and two cards are accidentally dealt face up. And after you deal those two cards face up, you announce, well, we should throw these cards in, and I should reshuffle, and we should start this hand over anew. And your friend who you're playing poker with, he's actually looked at his hand, and he says, and including one of the cards that you threw to him, it happened to be an ace dealt face up. And he says to you, actually, no, I'd prefer to play this one out. And you disagree, and you have an irresolvable, or a seemingly irresolvable difference of opinion. How might you go about trying to resolve that disagreement? There are a few methods you might consider. You might look, if you're playing, so for example, if you were playing poker in a casino and if they had rules written, or if you were playing in some sort of league, you might consult a document that would have rules that might cover what should happen in this sort of example. Absent that, if there was somebody that was watching the game and you knew that they had no stake in either one of you winning, if they had a reputation for being unbiased in these matters, if you didn't have the contract, you might ask a spectator, what do you think should be done in this sort of circumstance? Now, it could be that nobody's actually watching you play. It could be that the two of you are playing. You might even be playing for a substantial amount of money, but just the two of you are in the room, and there's nobody else watching. And the rules, the written rules, whatever you might be following, if you're even following written rules, then maybe they don't cover this sort of circumstance. So another tact you might want to take is consider a hypothetical spectator. And the thought behind this is as follows. The two of you are very interested in the results of this hand, and the information that's been revealed and your stake that you already have in the game might be biasing your opinion. So you might be making the judgment that you want the hand thrown in based on the fact that you know one of your opponent's face-up cards is very good. And your opponent might be basing his opinion on that same piece of information, but want that card. You're both rationally self-interested after all. So what you might want to think about is, what would an unbiased spectator say in this position? So absent a referee, if there were a referee watching over this game, what might they say, and what would be the reasons why they would say it? That's one line of attacking this difficulty. Finally, another way of attacking it is imagine a hypothetical contract. So note, you have actual contract, actual spectator, hypothetical contract. The pattern holds here. So absent a real contract, absent an actual spectator, you might imagine, well, let's say we were in a position before this hand happened, and we were tasked with figuring out what rules poker games should follow in situations just like this. What rules might we have come up with, and why would we come up with those rules? So you would be thinking in that circumstance not just about this particular situation, but how you would want these types of situations handled if many people were to find themselves playing poker, many different types of people. What would be the fair way to resolve this circumstance? Now, before we move to Rawls's inroad, to Rawls's thought experiment here, which is very similar to the hypothetical spectator, the hypothetical contract idea here, let's think about why we might want to take these lines when thinking about morality and when thinking about politics. One reason we might want to do that is because we find ourselves in entrenched battles about moral issues and about political issues very frequently. So often I feel when I start engaging in discussions on social media that it's a different sort of game than what I'm interested in, which is finding the truth. But then I go on social media and I see that people often are not interested in finding the truth. It's more like talking in issues of politics and morality. It's more like talking about sports even. So changing somebody's mind on these issues proves incredibly difficult, perhaps even impossible, depending on who you're talking to. And I fall victim to that myself in many ways, and you might find that you do as well. Somebody comes at you with an opposing view, it's sort of like a game to shoot each other down in the most spectacular way so that you can later say on social media that that the other person was owned or something like that, right? So it's it seems that these discussions often are not aimed at finding the truth. There may be a different sort of thing going on there. And yet, we do have to make decisions about how society is run, how we should guide our behavior. So, if we want to come to some truth on that, even though there are entrenched, seemingly irresolvable opinions, and that those opinions are formed by like really deep features of people, so the people they grew, their people's upbringing, their experiences in the world, their views are often based on those things. So if you just try to attack their view, you're actually attacking something even deeper that they're not, and things that they're not willing to give up. So how can we find any sort of common ground to resolve these sort of differences? Well, we might take some guidance from the way Rawls does this. This is the problem that faced Rawls. How do we solve these seemingly intractable differences, these irresolvable differences? He's going to take the latter route, just like these imagined poker players might take. What would people have thought before they saw this particular instance, if they didn't know us, the two people playing cards? What sort of rules might they make? So a combination of the third and fourth tactic here. And let's get into exactly what he says about that. So he comes up with a thought experiment, and he places people in what he calls the original position. So the goal for these people, imagine that a group of people was tasked with determining the principles of justice that society should be organized around. And they are like us in that they're rational, self-interested, autonomous beings, so they're able to be motivated by moral concerns. They're also free to think how they would like, so they're rational, they're primarily interested in their own well-being, they're free, and imagine they have equal voting stature. So all these people who are thinking about how society should be organized, imagine each of them has a single vote. So in that way, they're like us. But imagine that these people were behind what Rawls calls a veil of ignorance. So they were unaware of many things on which people base these types of decisions. Many features of people that bias them in one way or the other. So imagine that they were unaware of what race they were, what class they come from, what their occupation was. Imagine they were even unaware of things that they valued and their plans for getting the things that they valued. Now that strips a lot away from people. It might be very difficult to imagine this even being a person at this point. So one way you can start to think about it, imagine somebody had severe amnesia, right? So imagine you could gather together a group of people who had very recently been in a severe car crash, right? There was a huge car crash and all these people got amnesia, right? And they were all in body casts. And they had complete amnesia about their lives, but they did remember, so they were unaware of things like their race, the class, their occupation, their pay, and even they couldn't even remember what sort of things they liked and how they went about going to get the things that they liked. But imagine they did realize some things. So they were unaware of what position they occupied in the world, and they were unable to remember what their life plan was. But they did remember facts about humanity generally. So they did realize that people want certain primary goods. Goods like liberty, so here meaning freedom to choose to do what they want, like opportunity, so that's having the means to do what one wants to do, and wealth, which is also a tool to to get the sorts of things that people like. And then there's a further one that Rawls adds, which is called the social bases of self-respect. We'll just shorten that to talking about self-respect, right? So people generally want liberty, opportunity, wealth, and opportunities to feel self-respect. People generally want those things, but these people are unaware of how they tried to get these things and unaware of the position they occupied in society. Rawls's thought experiment here asks us to consider what principles would these people choose to govern society. So people who are unaware of their race, class, and occupation, even values and plans, but we're aware that people generally want freedom, opportunity, wealth, and a chance to earn some self-respect for themselves. It's easy to see some things that they wouldn't choose, right? So things that they wouldn't choose would be things that would unfairly advantage some groups at the expense of other groups. Why wouldn't they choose rules like that? They wouldn't choose rules like that because they might come out of their amnesia and realize that they had disadvantaged themselves, right? So keep in mind that these people are rational and self-interested, so they want what's best for them. So if they unfairly disadvantage some race, class, occupation, gender, or way of seeking, or if they disadvantage people that have one sort of life plan versus people that have another sort of life plan, then they might come out of their amnesia or come into the world, however you want to think of this, and find out that they had disadvantaged themselves and people like them. And that would be a circumstance that we would want to avoid. So we would want to make sure that people had a certain baseline liberty, opportunity, wealth, and chance to earn self-respect, so that whatever social situation you find yourself in, you can succeed and live a worthwhile human life. All right, so now we'll get to the principles that Rawls drew out of this thought experiment. So what would these people think? What is like the contract that they would come up with? So Rawls came up with two principles of justice. And the first states, each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive set of basic liberties, compatible with a similar liberty for others. So we want a full suite of the sort of liberties that we think of having in society. So things like like freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, right to a fair trial, a right to be treated equally under the law. These are all things that we would want to ensure that people had from behind the veil of ignorance. If we created a world such that people did not have these things, or certain groups of people did not have these things, and we came into that world, we would be very disappointed to find ourselves in that sort of situation where we did not have these rights. So these rights are primary. Note also the limitation here, that each person has a right such that has this suite of rights such that it's compatible with other people having these rights as well. So we would want people to have a right to have a say in their government, and an equal right to have a say in how their government would operate. And one thing we should note there is if somebody gets incredibly powerful, unlimitedly powerful, like if there was no limit on the amount of power that they could get, and if we had a system where people could use, say, money to, and the more money they had, the more influence they had on the way their government was run, that would be problematic. That would violate this first principle. So we would want to ensure that people have equal rights, and part of that would be an equal say in how their government was run. And we wouldn't want to allow people to have so much of a say that other people's say was limited or non-existent. I know many people who don't vote for this reason. They say, look, it doesn't matter what I vote for. I have no voice. I have no say in what our government does. And people with money can pay for advertising. They can donate to politicians, and they can, in effect, will laws into existence. So that would violate this first principle of equal liberty for all. Now, the second principle, Rawls rather confusingly breaks up into two pieces. So if we want to make them sort of one, we can say the second principle is about social. The first principle is about liberty and rights. The second principle is about social and economic inequalities and how they should be arranged. So, according to Rawls, social and economic inequalities are justified only if they are first, they are attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. So, what does this mean? This means that if there is a position that brings with it more pay, more benefits than others, then that position should be open to all, so anybody should be able to apply, under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. So not only should anybody be able to apply, but also Rawls emphasizes that if there's a position like this, then we should see it like, say, they're like CEOs, right? They make a lot of money, they get tremendous benefits and have tremendous power. We would want to see out of CEOs that there is equal representation from all of the races, classes, genders, that we find in the population, if the society is just. So if the society is just, if there are 20% white people in the population, then we would want to see this position reflect that as well. 20% white people in the position, right? Good. So now the next part of this principle is called, usually referred to as the difference principle. So social and economic inequalities are justified only if they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. So up to this point, Rawls has talked about equality and rights, equal representation in positions of power. And now, so up until this point, we might think he's so focused on this idea of equality. But one concern we might have is he leveling down, right? Is he creating a society in such that any differences in talent or power would be cut off at the knees, right? So leveling down to like a lowest common denominator. Is that what's happening? And this difference principle shows that while Rawls values equality, and he thinks that people behind a veil of ignorance would value equality, because they might find themselves in different sort of circumstances when they lost their amnesia or found themselves placed in society. He doesn't want to level down. He wants to allow people's talents to benefit others, benefit themselves, and benefit others. So this is how he does it. He says inequalities are just, so the baseline is equality, social and economic equality. But he allows for inequality only in the case that inequality leads to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. And that is a little bit difficult to wrap our head around, so let's look at a chart here to help us out. And then we'll come back and talk about why somebody behind a veil of ignorance might choose these principles. But first, let's get it clear in our heads what the principle is. So recall, we're talking about the difference principle here, the second part of his second principle. So imagine 4 different economies, A, B, C, and D, and 3 different groups in those economies, the least advantaged group, the middle group, and the most advantaged group. Imagine in those different economies, resources end up being divided in different ways. So the least advantaged group has a certain amount, which is less than the middle group, which is less than the most advantaged group. Except in case A, where everything's equal, right? So if equality were the only thing that we were concerned about, then economy A is the economy we would choose. But not only are we concerned with economy, or with equality, we're also concerned with overall utility. So how do we balance equality and overall utility? The difference principle is an attempt to do that. So note, if you were a utilitarian here, which economy would be the one that you would choose? It would clearly be economy D. That's the one with the highest overall, or the highest net benefit here. Imagine there's a correlation between the units here and the happiness of the people, right? So the society you might choose here would be D, because it's maximizing the amount of whatever the unit is here. So we get 620 in that economy. And that might be justified on a utilitarian because it would provide the most overall, and that's what we'd be trying to produce, assuming there was the connection between the monies and the happiness. But that would not be the one that would be justified according to Rawls's difference principle. The difference principle balances overall utility with a concern for equality. So recall it says inequalities are justified only if they're to the greatest advantage of the least advantaged members. So which inequalities would be justified? It would not be B or D. In those inequalities, they aren't best off for the least advantaged group. What's best off for the least advantaged group would obviously be C. And note that in economy C there is inequality, but that inequality is justified because it's to the greatest advantage of the least advantaged group. So this is an interesting effort. This is part of what this difference principle is unique, was sort of revolutionary, if not really revolutionary. It actually sort of had the effect of justifying a view of what the status quo was, but maybe it could be used for more revolutionary projects. But it was new, it was novel, that's the word I'm looking for. It was a novel view, a novel way to balance equality with utility. So the idea behind this difference principle is that the distribution of social goods and natural talents is often, in large part, a person is not responsible for those, and people are not responsible for those, especially natural talents. What do people do to deserve being born with natural talents? What do people do to deserve being born into more well-off families? Clearly nothing. They're just born into those circumstances. Now, what they do with those circumstances, they may or may not be responsible. What they end up doing with them might be due in large part to the starting point, right? So the idea here is that the distribution of natural talents and the social goods that people are born into is not, people don't deserve those things. They just happen to them. So what we want to do is we value equality but we want to use those natural talents for the benefit of all. So in this difference principle, there's a deep social unity. And Rawls's quote on this is, "In justice as fairness, men agree to share in another's fate." So what we want to do is we want everybody to be as well off as possible, but we especially are concerned with the least advantaged group. And why? Rawls's thinking behind this is, if we were behind a veil of ignorance, we would want to ensure that before we recovered from our amnesia, or before we were born into the world that we had planned for, before we knew how we would be born into it, we would want to ensure that there would be a certain baseline of liberties that were equal for everybody, and that there were enough resources to ensure that whichever position we were born into, that we'd have the resources available to us to be able to succeed. And this is one way to try to ensure that. All right, so today we introduced John Rawls. We talked about his novel thought experiment to get us to think about contractarianism in sort of a new light, the two principles that came out of that thought experiment, and we learned how to clarify those principles, and some types of things that these principles would not allow, and some things that they would allow. So next time I'm going to cover the advantages and disadvantages of contractarianism, or some hurdles at least that people have attempted to deal with and still continue to try to deal with. And we'll also talk more especially about disobedience in social contract theory and contractarianism. If we would all choose to be in society because nature is nasty, brutish, and short, or if we were trying to escape prisoner's dilemma type situations, or if behind a veil of ignorance we would all choose to arrange society according to principles of justice and live in that society, then what can we do? Is disobedience ever justified? That will be a primary focus of the next lecture. Thanks for sticking with me on this one. I'll talk to you next time.